Now we have Sofie Cools from the KU Leuven to talk about shareholder activism and short-termism. I should thank Sofie in particular because we actually had first Anna scheduled to present, but she couldn't be here for medical reasons, and Sofie stepped in, moved from discussant role to presenter role in a week, and actually because of other obligations in a weekend or something. So thank you, Sofie, in particular. Also thanks to Anne, because she stepped in as a discussant, then also very much at the last minute. So I think maybe a bit more improvised than you would probably have hoped for, but I'm sure it's all going to be great anyway. You have the picture? Yes, that should work.
Thank you very much, Tom. Also, thanks to Professor Roy for inviting me. I have to say it's quite exciting for me because I was going to be a respondent and I thought, oh, that's interesting to connect shareholder activism with short-termism. I have no clue what she's going to say. This is going to be interesting and I'll just listen and give some thoughts. And so now I have to quickly get some thoughts myself. But we all know, having been in there for a short term doesn't mean being short-termist. So let's go for it. And I will share with you my very preliminary thoughts on the topic, and I'm extra curious to hear your thoughts as well. So I will be very short on the first point because you've heard many definitions of short-termism already, but just briefly to be clear, because I want to move on to the relationship between activism and short-termism, and for that it's important that we're sure we're talking about the same thing. Then I would like to add the agency perspective. It has already been done in the comments just now, because I think in the short-termist discussions, we often forget the basic, or many people who claim that there is short-termism forget that there is also something like agency costs. And then with that in mind, I will go into the question, are there differences between the US and Europe, as this is a conference looking at the European situation? So short-termism is often used in a very broad sense, but I think there are two things we need to clarify. First, who is short-termist? And there Tom clearly explained that it can be both the investors and management, or one of them, or none of them. And then the other question is, for whom is the decision taken actually short-termist? Who is going to suffer in the long run? And there Professor Rowe made a clear distinction between type A short-termism, like where the company will suffer, for instance, by cutting R&D in order to be able to distribute a dividend now. And then he distinguished the type B problem, where a company is externalizing costs on stakeholders, like employees, like the general public or the environment. And I think part of that can be seen as a short-termist problem, just not at the level of the company, but at the level of society. Obviously, if we're now going to emit a lot of greenhouse gases, or we're polluting a lot now, we're not getting the bill now, but we're going to get it later as a society. So we can see it as a type B short-termism, but clearly not everything that is a type B problem is also type B short-termism, like not treating your employees better than is necessary to perform well is maybe not a short-termism problem. So then activism, I will look at activism, meaning attempts made by shareholders to influence corporate decision-making. They can do that either by using corporate law rules, like submitting shareholder proposals, asking questions at the shareholders meeting, but they can also do it with informal negotiations or talks with the management, or by putting a lot of pressure on the management in media and on social media and in the press, but also by suing the company. But what I'm not going to look at is speculative trading. Kim Wiley has shown clearly that that can actually have an influence, a short-termist influence, if shareholders are going to excessively discount long-term benefits of a certain decision. But this is not activism. So this is not, if shareholders are going to discount long-term benefits, they are not doing that with the purpose of influencing decision-making. And then I'm also not going to look at high-frequency trading, which has also often been invoked in the context of short-termism. High-frequency trading that is not going to affect corporate decision-making and it's definitely not a form of activism. But so, assuming that short-termism exists, let's look at the relationship between activism and short-termism. Conceptually, the link between activism and short-termism can be twofold. The central claim in the debate has been that shareholder activists, and in particular hedge funds, are pushing for short-termist decisions. So they are the cause of short-termist decision-making in companies. This is a thought that the SEC has followed when in 2010 it wanted to reduce it reduced shareholder access to the company's proxy to shareholders who had held the shares for at least 3 years. It's also a thought that was followed in the Ernst & Young study for the European Commission. Not that I want to give that study too much credit, but it was tending towards insulating directors in order to protect the company from short-termist pressure by the shareholders. And the same thought has probably also played a role, or has played a role, in the creation of voting rights in several European jurisdictions. But the relationship between activism and short-termism can also go into the other direction. If it's the directors and the managers that are short-termist, if we're talking about managerial short-termism, then shareholder activism could actually help to reduce short-termist decision-making. And this is a reasoning that we're not finding that often in the literature and with policymakers, but we can find it back, for instance, in the K review, which was a review commissioned in the UK to determine how equity markets could function more on the long term. It's also something that we can find back in the amended Shareholders' Rights Directive that aims at facilitating long-term engagement by shareholders, and that also aims at having a better connection between listed companies and the actual asset owners. So there is a belief that maybe investors can do something against short-termism. So this is conceptually, the link can be in two directions. Empirical evidence on short-termism by shareholder activists is mixed and is mostly dealing with shareholder activism as a cause of short-termism. Also because this is also the thought that was made most often by policymakers, as we saw before, by policymakers and in the literature. So there are on shareholder activism as a cause of short-termism, the empirical evidence is basically 50-50. There are studies generally on short-termism already, but also on short-termist activism. There are studies that find that intervention by shareholder activists is bad in the long run. There is this famous study by Bramers and others that has been revised a few times, I think. I haven't compared the different versions, but as I understand it, they found that firms targeted by hedge fund activism are performing, are improving in value, but less than similar firms that are probably also poorly performing before, that are not targeted by hedge fund activists. So that is evidence of short-termist activism, but there is also evidence that activism does not have long-term costs. And there's this study of Leuven, Alan Braff, and Wei Zhang that finds that gains in performance after intervention by shareholder activists don't come at the expense of long-term performance. And that there is also no such thing as a pump and dump effect where the stock price is going to suddenly drop after the activist has left the company. So the empirical evidence on activism as a cause is mixed. I don't think, or at least I haven't found much empirical evidence on shareholder activism as a cure for short-termism. There is a study that Zacharias Sautner has just discussed of Flammert and Bansal that somehow relates to it, but they sort of found this as a side issue. They wanted to investigate how long-term orientation in executive compensation affects firm value. So they needed an exogenous change in the executives' long-term incentives. So they looked at shareholder proposals on executive compensation that just passed or failed with a narrow margin. And so this is the exogenous shock. And they found that the shareholder proposals on executive compensation actually had a positive impact on firm performance. It's not a proof that shareholder activism is generally a cure for short-termism, but it at least shows that there is shareholder activism that actually functions as a cure for short-termism. But I think there's a room for empirical research there, unless someone knows about studies, and then I would be very happy to hear about it. So the empirical evidence is mixed. The conceptual link is bidirectional. Let's just look at the conceptual link. In 2 days, I wasn't able to do empirical research. So let's add the agency perspective again. Even if we accept that short-termism is a problem, it's not the only problem that companies face. We have to bear in mind that shareholder rights also serve the function of mitigating the first agency conflict. And this is most evident in the case of dividend distributions. Dividend distributions are the one example always cited when we're talking about short-termism by shareholder activists. They're always pushing for dividends for the quick benefit. But the payment of dividends actually can also help to reduce the first agency conflict. And there I have to refer to Jensen's free cash flow hypothesis, where Jensen said managers of companies that have excess cash flows tend to prefer inefficient investments over dividend distributions. And so the possibility for shareholders to push for a dividend distribution can actually help. It can avoid this, and it can reduce the resources that board directors and managers have under their control. And that will make them more subject to the disciplining effect of the markets. If they need to finance another project, they will have to tap the capital markets, and so they will have to comply with the demands of the capital markets. So dividend distributions aren't necessarily a short-termist decision. We have to look at both perspectives. So this was the function of the agency perspective with regard to investor short-termism. The agency perspective is also important when we look at the managerial short-termism. The other typical example cited when we're talking about short-termism is the directors and managers pushing the stock price up quickly when the stock is vesting, as we just discussed. So they have this short-termist interest. This is actually a sort of first agency conflict. And they can also have this conflict with regard to dividend distributions. At least that will depend on the executive compensation package. But if there's no dividend protection in their stock options, their executive compensation package will give the executive an incentive to just make sure that there's a quick boost in the stock price at the moment that they will actually be able to sell their shares. So here it's actually an agency strategy, the reward strategy. We said stock compensation can be very effective, but it also causes a new agency conflict. And again, there activism can serve as a cure. So short-termism is sometimes an easy argument invoked by managers and directors. I'm not saying that it is never correct. All I'm trying to say is that we have to balance, or we have to look at the two perspectives. Is a decision short-termist, but can it also be that it is actually helping to solve or at least mitigate the first agency conflict? So let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. And then this also raises an interesting question, I think. I haven't wrapped my head around it completely, what I have to think about it, so I'm very curious to hear what you're thinking about it. But could regulation of these agency strategies actually influence short-termist activism? And if so, how? And what I'm going to discuss now is relevant both for this type A short-termist and for type B short-termism. I didn't see how much time is. Okay, so these are just known differences affecting levels of activism. Stock ownership structures has been dealt with by Tom. Ownership disclosure obligations, the more transparency you have to give, and the quicker you have to inform the market of your stake building, the more difficult it's going to be to have a surprise. But what I wanted to focus on is differences influencing the choice of activist tools and their impact. Although there I'm not really sure yet in what direction it goes. Submitting shareholder proposals in Europe is more difficult in the sense that there are higher thresholds for being able to add a shareholder proposal to the agenda. We don't talk about the proxy, but about the agenda than in the US. The percentages are mostly higher. One could say, well, market capitalization is generally lower, so maybe that compensates a bit, but generally it seems that that is a bit of a hurdle to get over that is higher in Europe. Then there are some shareholder powers that are different in Europe and in the US. I mean, I'm just roughly speaking now, but many of these so-called short-termist decisions relate to things that in Europe are power of the shareholders meeting. For instance, the authority to declare a dividend. I wasn't able to look into it in detail, but I think in the US that's the board who is deciding, and in Europe that's typically the shareholders meeting. The same, yeah, not the same. Appointment and removal of directors is a bit more easy in Europe, although things have improved in the US due to amendments of charters and bylaws of many companies, at least in the large listed companies, and it's getting a bit more difficult in Europe, but still Europe, it seems to be a little more easier in Europe than in the US. And say on pay, there are also small differences. And so I was wondering if the decision on dividends is a decision that is made by the shareholders meeting in Europe, maybe that is just not perceived as shareholder activism. If you're just voting against a certain proposal by the board to distribute a certain dividend, do we qualify that as shareholder activism? Whereas to get the same effect in the US, you would have to launch a campaign to push the board to make a different decision. So, yeah, my question is that then not perceived as activism in Europe, and it is in the US? But there I would also have to think about it, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts. And then this is my last slide, which is relevant both for type A short-termism and type B short-termism. Most decisions that are set to be short-termist, other than the ones that belong to the competence of the shareholders meeting, will actually relate to the board's competence for strategy. The same when investors are actually acting as a cure and are, for instance, submitting climate proposals. This is considered a strategy issue. And so this is the board's competence. And in Europe, it's not said explicitly in the Shareholders' Rights Directive, but it's generally accepted. If shareholders are submitting a proposal that is actually doesn't belong to the competence of the shareholders meeting, the board can say, well, no, there's no point adding it to the agenda. The meeting is not even competent. And there is something similar in the US, where the SEC rules allow the board to exclude a proposal from the company's proxy if they relate to ordinary business. So I think this can be used, this exception can be used by the board for many short-termist proposals. It seems that in the US it will be more easy to add it to the company's proxy. Definitely when it comes to climate resolutions, there has been an announcement by the SEC 2 years ago that that a certain exception, namely the exception for proposals relating to policy issues so significant that it would be appropriate for a shareholder vote, that will be applied in a more generous way, in the sense that you don't have to show significance for the particular company, but significance generally, like climate, can already help. So I think it will be more easy to add proposals in the US. And what do activists do in the UK? They can give binding instructions to the board. I will just immediately go to advisory votes. This is the way that is used in the US. It's possible in France, in Belgium, but in the Netherlands, shareholders cannot force the board to add a proposal to the agenda on strategic issues and to hold a vote. They can only ask to add a discussion item on which we can talk in the shareholders meeting, but we cannot vote. In Germany, the latter is not even possible. So I think my time is more or less over. If we're talking about shareholder short-termism, we also have to keep in mind this different legal background. There is less room for activism in Europe, or at least several forms, are more difficult, we have to think whether that is a good or a bad thing, because shareholder activism can be both a cause and a cure of short-termism.
Yes. Okay, hi everybody. Can you all hear me? Because my voice is a bit soft and yeah, okay, great. So my name is Anne Lafarre and I'm invited to comment on Sofie's presentation, but to be honest, I also tried to also put a little bit in of my own research, because also this morning in the train, we didn't know exactly what we were going to say today. So that's a little bit my story. But I hope that it will be very much appropriate for this event, and that you have a nice 10 minutes at least. Let's go for that. So my research is in the area of ESG, and that's also what I want to start with. And it's actually a little bit where Sofie ended with, namely that nowadays we have these investors that are also having activism in the area of ESG. And there's a large bunch of literature, as you all know, about ESG and about investors that are claiming to be sustainable and fostering sustainability in their investing companies. At the same time, we all know that there is also some important doubts whether there is greenwashing. We heard it before today as well, including the climate scarf of Larry Fink. I'm doubting actually today whether he would wear it again, given all these anti-ESG campaigns at the moment. And then we have a whole bunch of literature stating that there are large differences between international or different nationalities of investors actually acting sustainable or pretending, like greenwashers. That depends on where their home state is located, and also the different investor types. So there has been some researchers stating that, for instance, asset owners are more non-constrained. So, for instance, pension funds really need to act within the interest of their beneficiaries. And if you add these things together, you see that, generally speaking, also reported by research, investors in Europe can be more sustainable than, for instance, in the US. There has been some research from Share Actions, but they always launch these reports on ownership matters. And they state that, well, among the sustainable investors around the world are these Dutch and other European investors. Also, I did some research there. And what I did is I focused on the methodology of Bolton and others. They had the investor ideology paper. And what they did, they used the W-nominate model to map institutional investors' voting behavior and see their preferences. And I did the same, but then with being sustainable or not. And here you see -1 is left wing. So I plotted left wing, the sustainable investors. And on the right, I plotted the more brown or classical investors, not really supporting climate change proposals and other ESG proposals. And you see that indeed the Dutch and European investors are more located to the right, and to the left you see it's data until 2021. So I have to admit it's not the latest 2 years of proxy votes, but even then BlackRock was still advocating to support ESG topics, and yet they are all at the upper right of this graph. I cannot show you the methodology in the paper, but I would like to indicate a little bit of evidence that, well, the Dutch investors, the European investors are not doing that bad in terms of actually acting sustainable. However, and that's where the link is with Sofie's story, particularly in the Netherlands, so I'm Dutch, I'm from the Netherlands, we have this sentiment resulting from past shareholder activism cases that shareholders are bad for the company, and that we need to have strong boards and also protect the company and the boards with all kinds of legal rights for boards, but also contractual possibilities. Like we have these oligarchic clauses that allow corporate boards to really limit the shareholder rights that are there in the statutes. For instance, to amend the Articles of Association. In the Netherlands, that's a shareholder right, but it can only be done in most of the cases by a proposal of the corporate boards. So we have now these sentiments that, with all these cases in the Netherlands, that we need to combat shareholder short-termism. And And then you see both type A kind of short-termism, but also type B. And there's a little bit of indifference in using the two ways of short-termism into combating everything that relates to shareholder activism. At the same time, we see this whole movement. We see these Dutch institutional investors acting quite sustainable, and we also see the research of Hart and Zingales, for instance, that shareholders have all kinds of different preferences. So there's not just the active, aggressive hedge fund type that was there before, and that was the leading activist in these cases. We have more type of shareholders nowadays. Moreover, also at the European level, we see nowadays a lot of legislative initiatives focusing nowadays on the role of shareholders. And there has been some authors stating that shareholders not only have rights anymore, but they also have duties in the European framework. So I hope I make the story a bit clear, but my thought is, okay, we have on the one hand, we have these sustainable investors in the Netherlands that are, according to research, at least acting more sustainable than some of their American counterparts. And at the same time, we have this more conservative Dutch legal framework that really has this principle of board autonomy and feels that, or at least that's the sentiment in the Dutch market practice and with the Dutch legislator, that everything related to shareholder activism is a bad thing. Me, that is a little bit of a diverging two things. But let's focus on one example, shareholder proposals. And Sofie already mentioned this in her presentation, that indeed they are quite restricted in Europe in terms of the topics that shareholders can bring to the agenda. So everything that's a matter of the corporate board, shareholders cannot really propose anything on. And in the Netherlands, we go one step further, stating indeed that shareholders, as regards strategy matters, can only propose an agenda as a discussion item. So the board can even refuse advisory shareholder proposals related to strategy matters, including, for instance, climate change matters and other environmental aspects. At the same time, we see nowadays also empirical evidence that before they were assumed to be gadflies, these shareholders that propose these shareholder proposals to the agenda, nowadays we see that they can have an impact. So there were some studies already mentioned in the previous presentations that shareholder proposals can have actually impacts on ESG matters. We have some studies also from Rob Bauer stating that withdrawn shareholder proposals can also even have an impact. And they seem to be a powerful tool nowadays. So we also have some evidence from practice. The Shell 2021 AGM, you probably remember that they got 30% in favor of a climate resolution. Last Thursday or Wednesday, I think it was Total Energies. They also had the 30% in favor vote of a climate resolution. So we do not see these very small minorities anymore, but we actually see kind of big, not majorities, but still kind of big, concerts of shareholders acting in favor of these resolutions. However, there is also some problems here. Yes, so there are many problems with shareholder resolutions, but for this presentation, I would like to signal three with the production scenario in the back of my head. So we saw that in 2022 and 2023, Shell, so sorry, I made a typo this morning, there was only 20% in favor of the same shareholder resolution. So this was a shareholder resolution on climate change, and particularly to be Paris aligned. And whereas before in 2021, the shareholders had a 30% vote in favor of their proposal. Now in 2022 and 2023, so there's a typo on the sheet, it's only 20%. And we see that, or maybe this can be a steady state for now. And on the one hand, you see that the big three and other institutional investors may opt out, do not vote in favor anymore, so they change their votes, maybe because of the ESG discussion that we see in the US. But also we see that maybe the divestment movement actually decreases the number of green shareholders in the company and only leaves these brown investors that do not vote in favor. What is also interesting is that, so if we have the Netherlands in our back, in the back of your head, you can see that in the Netherlands we have also very international investors base, meaning that about 80% or even more of the shares of the largest Dutch companies are actually owned by foreign investors. So even if the Dutch investors are sustainable, then still it doesn't mean that actually your shareholder base as a Dutch company is actually sustainable as well. As regards the third point, so we do see that not only US investors are becoming more constrained by these anti-ESG movements, but also European investors tend to be affected nowadays. And I saw this morning when I was in the train, I saw actually an interesting example of how this movement affects also European investors, and that is the Net Zero Insurance Alliance example, meaning that AXA, but also Allianz, actually backed out of this climate alliance on ESG, and it was stated that the reason that they did this was because they actually wanted to avoid difficulties in the US market related to anti-competitive behavior claims. So we see that also nowadays the US trends are affecting institutional investors in Europe. So these are some difficulties that I spot. So I think we can, in the Netherlands and in Europe, allow shareholders to have a bit more rights, and particularly the shareholder rights, as a tool to use their activism in a good way and to foster sustainability, because empirical research shows that they are more sustainable, or acting more sustainable than the US counterparts. But at the same time, there are some difficulties, as I just showed. And I have some final thoughts. So this is a bit of a maybe unstructured story, but I hope that you can follow my line of thoughts. First of all, investor-led sustainability will definitely not solve all sustainability problems, not at all. So please do not count on it. However, it can actually have some helpful means in a way that we need to leverage the potential of shareholders. So I would say board autonomy is key. Shareholders do not really have the knowledge of what is going on in the company, so we need to keep that. So in that sense, I don't want to change the Dutch system. And the focus on ESG transparency for me is key. So in that sense, Europe is going in the right direction. And I think the SEC is also following that direction. But I can say that, at least I would like to put that out here now, the Dutch legislator and other legislators in the EU member states can actually take the role of shareholders more seriously. If they have shareholder duties, let them also have the tools to act on these duties, including the shareholder proposal right as an escalation tool. And at the same time, do not use the misplaced short-termism and argument just to enhance the board's autonomy and the protection mechanisms that we have for the company. So I would say that just as a proposal, we have board autonomy, but shareholders may be able to set broader lines in terms of sustainability issues, so also the boundaries for sustainability issues, like, for instance, being Paris aligned, and use tools for that. And for instance, I was thinking about the following when I was reading the Hart and Zengales research of 2022, namely that what we can do is we can say, okay, the corporate board identifies the ESG issues that are relevant for the company, the material ESG issues. They can even put that in the article of association, and they have to do that because of the European regulation or the directive, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. Then what we can do is we can for instance, in the Netherlands, give shareholders an advisory votes on these ESG matters that the board identifies as being material. And then finally, I think I put this as a final point to make also sure that we have the full link to the European models. I was thinking about concentrated ownership structures. Okay, even then, so you would say, okay, why would it matter to have a shareholder proposal if you have a concentrated ownership structure anyway? But even there, these shareholders need to actually attract funding from the institutional investors in the market. So even if you think about Heineken as a very concentrated ownership structure company in the Netherlands, even Heineken needs to satisfy in the end their investors because they need the funding. So that was my final thoughts. So sorry for this messy presentation. I hope you got my main points. And I'm sorry, Sofie, that I didn't comment on all your points in the presentation. So thank you.
Okay. Any questions? From Hans?
I have a technical legal question for you, Anne, if I may. In the Netherlands, as I think you mentioned, it's quite common that the Articles of Association state that it's only the board that can put items on the agenda of the general meeting. My feeling is, and I would like to know what you think about this, that this is a gross violation that is completely incompatible with Article 6 of the Shareholder Rights Directive, which basically says if you have 5 or 3%, you are entitled to force the board to add an item to the agenda. But how do people in the Netherlands look at this, and what is your opinion on this as a lawyer?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So actually, there is this discussion in the Netherlands, and there are many academics stating the same. And I'm in the same. How do you say? I'm with the same team. I'm also feeling that this is really against the Shareholder Rights Directive.
Is it possible to defend the other? What are the arguments of the other side? It's Dutch law.
Yeah, yeah, but we had the shareholder proposal right before the introduction of the Shareholder Rights Directive, and then there was always like a test to see whether it still fits. And at the time they decided that it fitted. They didn't need any amendments to the Dutch law, so they feel it's appropriate giving the Shareholder Rights Directive. And I disagree. I feel that it's not in the light of the Shareholder Rights Directive. Yeah,
It's not even the only thing. In the Netherlands, there's also a rule now that the board has 180 days to think about a shareholder proposal, whether or not it is willing to put it on the agenda.
Yeah. But that's only in the situation, when you have a takeover or like a hostile situation. So indeed, changing the directors and or changing the articles of the association in such a way that the nature of the company changes. Yeah. So in the Netherlands, the previous panel was about that Dutch law allows everything. Dutch law doesn't allow anything, I would say.
But allows the board everything.
Yeah.
Actually, I also written about this in the past. I've also argued that it's a violation of the Shareholder Rights Directive. But I think the opposite argument is that the Shareholder Rights Directive doesn't regulate whether or not there's any conditions to the right to add items to the general meeting. So they say, well, of course you have to have a right, and that the Dutch law does, but we can impose conditions taking into account the corporate interest, and many other countries also have some kind of test, like France also has certain conditions for bringing shareholder proposals. So it's not that Dutch law is so unique, it just goes very extreme in this position, which I think becomes. I also, Marleen, a question?
Yes, indeed. So I was wondering, Sofie, because I think you outlined very nicely the legal situation, so the obstacles that shareholder activists have in sort of engaging with a company. And I was thinking specifically in light of the discussions we had earlier with the immense power of controlling shareholders, and who is even like left to bring a shareholder proposal and to gather those 3 to 5% or the other tools. So I was wondering, if you would have to take a stance, would you advocate for like an increase of those rights and more harmonization within the EU? Because as you showed, it's actually quite different depending on the member state.
I know that I have written that we have to think about it because there are many instruments saying that shareholders should be engaged and they should actually use their rights. And at the same time, it's limited in comparison to other jurisdictions. At least shareholders are required to consider ESG matters and to think about the type B problems, but they don't have formal power in this matter, which is very strange. It's very, don't have a definitive thought on it because obviously this is very much related to strategy. And if you're going to let shareholders to get involved in strategy when it comes to environmental issues, then why not for social issues? And where do we stop? So I don't know for sure yet what I have to think about it. Even though I wrote my PhD on the distribution of powers between shareholders and directors, it's a very difficult issue.
Sofie, I wanted to ask you, offer a third conceptual possibility how activists might have an influence on short-termism. You had like, they push it, they prevent it. And the third one is that the mere presence of activists, particularly nasty hedge fund Elliott types, creates perhaps short-termism just because they are out there, which makes it extremely difficult to study it empirically. Because if I'm a manager and I have, I think, a great project, I can do it the right way. But if I do it the right way, I have to do something now, spend some money or something that might look to the outside world as if I'm not a good manager. And then maybe Elliott will come out in and they will kick my butt in many ways. Or I can do it in a different way that's not as good. Maybe it takes longer, maybe it's more expensive overall, but it won't look bad to the outside world in the interim. And so what am I going to do? Obviously, when Elliott is around, I'm going to do the second thing. That's bad, but short-termism in the sense that I'm inflecting my actions. And would you accept that as a third possibility in your conceptual scheme? Or do you think?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, so this is a sort of an ex-ante effect before they've even done anything, based on perceived short-termism by hedge funds that is then on the basis of perception already transmitted. There we would have to look for ways to.
We know the following, that most US companies are constantly being advised by activism defense firms, investment banks and law firms on what to do in order to not be targeted by activists. Now, this could be good if it leads them to work harder and so on, but it could also have these negative consequences
However, there is a paper actually that shows these peer effects in the review of finance by Nick Ganchev and co-authors. I think they just look at these efficiency improvements that we see at the targeted firms, so they also arise at the peer firms. But I don't know about the other sides.
So I know that paper, and that goes in this direction. But yes, the other one is more generalized. Like your entire industry might not have been targeted yet you may feel it already.
The sharks in the water.
Yes.
They would just have to do. I think it's surely also a channel that I would have to add. And the way to solve it is somehow to turn this perception around and
Maybe I have a technical question. So in the US, as I understand, we believe that activists work well when they discuss with other long-term investors, and so they advance strategy and their interest. But in Europe, we have the market abuse that some limits. The first goal, which is insider trading. So insider information is not just information of the company, but also of an investor, which is targeting a firm. So you cannot discuss with Elliott freely, because then you have inside information just because you know that Elliott is targeting a company. And the second one is acting concept. So if Elliott start discussing with the several institutional investors, they can be considered acting in concert. Elliott wants to launch an activist campaign, can be considered a situation in which several investors are acting in concert and are crossing the 30% threshold, triggering a mandatory tender offer. So also acting in concert is something that scares a lot institutional investors. So I believe that market abuse also sometimes scares this kind of discussion that activists may have with long-term investors because they don't want to be considered acting in concert with the activists or having inside information or activist campaign.
Yes, I agree. I only mentioned the acting in concert on the slide, but I also wrote down that when you talk to other investors and especially when you talk to the company, it's dangerous because you might have inside information and then you cannot do anything anymore.
I think that's a key difference between US and Europe. That's why you don't have part in Europe because that cannot discuss with other investors and create a work pattern because otherwise it would be instead of trading.
Different opinions, yeah.
Well, no, not really a different opinion in theory, but with respect to the engagement and dialogue that are it's outside the general meeting with the company and institutional investors is not has been written, and as practical matter of fact, there are all the stewardship codes as well as the Italy where the policy by which the companies decide how they can dialogue with shareholders. So basically, there is a list of topics that can be discussed and a sort of a procedure for these discussions. So, of course, it is always a problem that there is a transmission of inside information, but it's not that only, let's say, sort of engagement on some general topic like ESG, or when shareholders want to place their attention at these topics in front of the corporation, they necessarily bear a risk of insider trading or a risk of acting in concert, which, from my point of view, always speaking on a personal perspective, but acting in concert is an offer that comes from the takeover directive, so must be interpreted in this context, like sort of an acquisition of corporate control. From years, I'm worried from looking at acting concert in any sort of situation because it's easy to say that today we are always acting in concert in the sense that we are also dealing to the same goal, which is to understand better a certain topic. But wait, acting in concert is in the takeover directive, so it must be seen as it is. This is my personal view. So, and it is also clear that in Europe, there is this tendency to develop and improve engagement that is outside the general meeting of shareholders. If we go back to this morning discussion, it has also been said that very often institutional investors, they do not register to a double voting right because their activism and their voice is put forward, the manager, the directors, not in the general meeting, but outside the general meeting. So this is a great point of discussion in corporate governance in Europe. Thank you.
Okay. We have to wrap our discussion. Maybe last question, Marco.
Yeah, so hedge fund activists have been pressurizing fossil fuel companies to either spin off renewables or to spin off fossil fuel assets. They've never pushed for fossil fuel assets to be shut down. Speaking to Zachariah's point, so at least on that front, they are very short-termist.
Yeah, there's also this study, the name escapes, but that says that institutional investors vote in favor of ESG proposals when they know that their voting power will not change. The final decision made.
But if they push sell assets, someone else is going to buy them, right? What difference does it make?
That's my point. It doesn't change the. It doesn't change the.
Saying that they should be pressuring them to shut the assets down, like turn them off, blow them up, right?
Send them to the moon. I don't know.
There's actually a hashtag for it. It's called "Keep It in the Ground."
That positive note, I think we can add to the coffee break.